Donetsk, a name that once echoed with the clamor of steel, the rhythm of coal mines, and the optimism of a rising industrial capital. Now it resonates with something far darker, an unrelenting echo of gunfire, propaganda, and fear. But what if I told you this city, long claimed by Russian-backed forces, has become one of the most dangerous traps ever laid in modern warfare? Not just a battlefield, but a boiling crucible where occupation turned into obsession and obsession into annihilation. Because behind the smokescreens of politics and tanks lies a haunting question that no one seems to want to answer. What happens when the invader thinks they've won, but the people they've conquered start writing the next chapter in blood? Today, we dive inside Donetsk, past the headlines, beneath the flags, and into the very bones of a city transformed from a geopolitical pawn into Ukraine's deadliest weapon. And the scariest part? It didn't start with bullets. It started with belief. But to understand how this war zone from hell came to be, we have to rewind to the calm before the carnage.
Donetsk, 2013, a thriving metropolis, fifth largest city in Ukraine. People sipping espresso near Pushkin Boulevard, football fans chanting for Shakhtar Donetsk in the roaring Donbass arena. If you looked from above, you'd see a European city grappling with post-Soviet identity, but firmly anchored in Ukrainian soil, until it wasn't.
Because in 2014, something cracked. And when it cracked, it didn't leak. It bled. Russia annexed Crimea. The world gasped, but it was eastern Ukraine that suffocated. Protests, real or staged, swept through Donetsk. Armed men with unmarked uniforms took over administrative buildings. Within weeks, a strange new fiction was being read aloud. The Donetsk People's Republic, a breakaway state, unrecognized, unvetted, but somehow armed to the teeth.
And here's where the illusion began. The Kremlin's playbook was clear. Seize territory through chaos, install loyalists, disguise invasion as rebellion. Repeat. On paper, it worked. By summer 2014, Ukrainian forces were pushed back. Russia denied everything. The DPR government set up offices, courts, even currency. But beneath the staged normalcy, something eerie lingered. Because Donetsk wasn't stabilizing. It was rotting. Imagine this. Entire city blocks abandoned. Children learning multiplication tables to the sound of shelling. Grocery stores where flour was stacked next to Kalashnikovs. At the local TV station, once broadcasting Champions League games, now a 24/7 loop of anti-Ukrainian propaganda. Still, Russia celebrated. They thought they'd built a puppet state. But they hadn't counted on what Ukraine would do next. See, most armies retreat to regroup, but Ukraine didn't just regroup, they evolved. Their military adapted, their intelligence deepened, and in the shadows, plans were hatched. Plans not just to resist Donetsk, but to transform it into a bleeding edge of psychological, urban, and insurgent warfare. The trap was being set. First came the ghost units. Ukrainian special forces embedded behind lines, not to hold territory, but to sow doubt. Communications were intercepted. Generals began whispering about invisible saboteurs dismantling infrastructure from within. Power grids, train lines, bridges, all systematically disabled or turned against the occupiers. Then came the artillery, but not in barrages, in whispers. Precision shelling. One DPR checkpoint gone, then another. But only on Mondays, then Thursdays. Always just enough to say, "You're not safe. We know where you sleep." And finally,
the minds. Ukraine weaponized the one thing Russia had been abusing all along, the narrative. They started broadcasting encrypted radio to Donetsk, not just music, but messages. Satirical songs about DPR leaders, whispered stories of Russian soldiers being abandoned, flyers dropped by drones reading, "Your commanders have families. Do they care if you die?" Some nights, residents reported hearing children's laughter through loudspeakers at 3 a.m., and it worked. Paranoia began to spread, not just among civilians, but among the occupiers themselves.
Because how do you hold a city when every window might be watching, when every child might be reporting, when every shadow feels like a sniper? But here's where things take a darker turn. In early 2016, something unthinkable happened. DPR leaders started disappearing.
First, it was local police chiefs, then military commanders, then a major Russian advisor, all found dead, some in locked rooms, others with suicide notes, too perfect to be real. A few were simply never found. Russia accused Ukraine. Ukraine said nothing, but someone was sending a message. And that message was clear. You may control Donetsk, but it's killing you from the inside. One Russian colonel described it like this: "We thought we had won Donetsk, but every month we lose more men than we do in active combat zones. And we don't even see who's killing us." Even civilians were no longer sure who to trust. Was your neighbor a loyal DPR worker or a Ukrainian informant? Was that aid package from Moscow or laced with listening devices? Fear became the most common currency. By 2018, Russia doubled down. They sent more troops, more surveillance, more cash. But that only accelerated the decay, because with more force came more friction. Warlords within the DPR began turning on each other. Corruption exploded. Russian aid vanished into luxury cars and black markets. And in the midst of it all, Ukraine watched. They weren't just fighting a war. They were letting their enemies rot in the prison they'd built for themselves. Now, you might wonder, why didn't Ukraine just invade and take Donetsk back? Because this wasn't about territory anymore. It was about attrition, about bleeding the enemy slowly, silently, and permanently. A new kind of warfare, one that didn't care about maps, only morale. It's been called the slow boil. Let your enemies simmer until they eat themselves alive. And by 2020, Donetsk wasn't a stronghold, it was a haunted house. A house full of ghosts. Some real, some imagined, but all deadly. And then, the full-scale invasion of 2022. Suddenly, Donetsk wasn't just an occupied city. It was the poster child of a failed dream. Russian troops flooded the region, thinking they'd be welcomed with parades. Instead, they got IEDs under bridges, grenades in sewers, snipers in steeples. Ukraine didn't just defend its borders, it activated a machine it had been building for 8 years. One buried beneath the ruins of Donetsk, a machine made of networks, sabotage, and rage. Even pro-Russian civilians began to reconsider. Why was life worse now than before the invasion? Why were their liberators living in mansions while they queued for bread? And here's the tragic twist. Donetsk had become unlivable for everyone. A once great city turned into a chessboard soaked in gasoline. And somewhere in the middle, Ukraine smiled, because sometimes the greatest victory isn't reclaiming land, it's making your enemies terrified to hold it. So what does this mean for the future of Donetsk? Will Ukraine ever retake it by force? Can peace be built on a foundation of fear? Or has the war already been won, not with tanks, but with time? And the deeper question, the one no general dares to ask, what if Ukraine never wanted Donetsk back in one piece? What if the goal was always to make it bleed? Because the scariest battlefield isn't the one lined with barbed wire, it's the one inside your mind. And Donetsk? That's not a city anymore. That's a curse. If this twisted strategy blew your mind, hit that subscribe button, because Chapter 2 will dive into the darkest secrets of Ukraine's underground resistance and how Donetsk became a prototype for a terrifying new kind of war. Donetsk was no longer just a city. It had become a symbol, a scar, a place where every cracked pavement and flickering light whispered of betrayal, where everyone was watching everyone, but no one really knew who they were watching for. By 2022, Russian tanks had rolled across the border in broad daylight, announcing what Moscow still dared to call a special military operation. But in Donetsk, the war had never really stopped. It had only evolved. Because beneath the burnt-out shell of public buildings and broken apartment blocks lay a secret no map could show, a war within the war. One so silent, so intricate, that most soldiers didn't even know they were pawns in it. This wasn't about territory, it was about truth, and who could erase it faster. Let's go back. Even before Russia's full-scale invasion, Ukraine's intelligence community, SBU, GUR, and independent cyber resistance cells had been planting seeds. Not just informants, but infrastructure. Everything from dummy SIM cards to ghost banking apps, fake courier services, mock hospitals. Entire businesses operated in Donetsk, but every one of them was a wire, a camera, a door left slightly ajar. At first, the Russian-backed Donetsk People's Republic, DPR, dismissed these efforts as rumor. But then came the leaks. Confidential documents exposed on Telegram. Troop locations aired live on Twitter. A commander's personal phone hacked, and his mistress's messages scrolled by millions. And then, silence. Phones across DPR-controlled Donetsk went dead. Entire sectors lost power. Maintenance, they said. But locals knew better. Ukraine had flipped the switch. This was digital insurgency. Surgical, anonymous, and terrifying. And in the midst of it all stood a mysterious group no one wanted to admit existed. Shadows of Slavyansk, a rumored cell of cyber-resistance fighters, saboteurs, and exiled Donetsk locals loyal to Ukraine. No faces, no leaders, just a logo, 2 crossed nails over a cracked rose. Some say they were responsible for the attacks on supply convoys in 2020. Others claim they were behind the assassination of Arsen Pavlov, Motorola, a DPR commander blown up in his own apartment lift. Officially, Ukraine has never acknowledged their existence, but ask anyone in Donetsk and they'll whisper they're watching. Always. And here's where the story turns from strategic to spiritual. Because for the people still living in Donetsk, not soldiers, not agents, just civilians, life became a theater of moral collapse. No side could guarantee safety. No promise meant anything. And so people adapted fast. Take Lyudmila, a retired nurse living 2 blocks from the old Donetsk Philharmonic. She used to treat wounded civilians. Now, she ran a black market pharmacy, mostly antibiotics and painkillers for injured DPR fighters too ashamed to go to hospitals. She was a patriot once. Now, she's just surviving. Or Vlad, a university dropout who once studied computer science. Now, he programs IED triggers disguised in Bluetooth speakers. He claims he's just selling to both sides, but deep down,
He hopes every boom means fewer men in uniforms on his street.
This is what Donetsk became, a city of orphans, not just of family, but of truth. And the most terrifying weapon? Loyalty. In a world where sides blur, where propaganda floods every screen, who do you trust? By 2023, Ukraine leaned fully into this chaos. They no longer had to fight for hearts and minds. They just had to make people question everything.
They began launching deepfake operations, not just generic fakes, but precise, targeted, intimate ones. A video showing a prominent DPR colonel accepting bribes from Ukrainian agents. Another clip of a Russian officer mocking Donetsk's civilians. Fake? Maybe. Convincing? Absolutely. And that's all that mattered. The Russian side scrambled. They issued warnings, cracked down on phones, banned foreign apps. But the damage was already done. Mistrust had metastasized.
And once mistrust spreads, it consumes everything. Soldiers stopped trusting their commanders. Commanders stopped trusting their troops. Entire patrol units defected, or worse, went rogue. The very fabric of occupation began to unravel. But Ukraine wasn't just playing defense anymore.
In early 2024, a new operation began, codenamed Sirens Hollow. Its goal? Not to take Donetsk, but to unmake it. Through a blend of drone warfare, psychological operations, and encrypted local broadcasts, Ukraine began broadcasting freedom zones inside the city. These were temporary, shifting areas where Ukrainian safe houses operated, offering food, medical aid, and information to locals who wanted out.
The catch? They disappeared within 48 hours. Some say they were bait. Others say they were mercy. Either way, people came, desperate, angry, hopeful. And every time one of these zones vanished, another rumor bloomed. That's how you break an occupation. Not with tanks, but with possibility. But it didn't stop there. Soon, Ukrainian forces began releasing classified intercepts of Russian units inside Donetsk, arguing, defecting, sometimes even threatening each other. Entire chat logs showed Russian officers pleading for reinforcements that never came. One message read, "We are sitting ducks in this ghost city. Every window feels like a grave." That message went viral. Ukraine didn't just release it, they printed it on posters, on billboards, in graffiti. All across Donetsk, every window feels like a grave. It became a slogan, a curse, a rallying cry. Because here's the brutal truth Russia couldn't swallow. They controlled the city, but Ukraine owned the story. And no war can be won if your story is broken. But even as Ukraine pushed harder, there was a cost. Civilians caught between two fires. Children who grew up knowing nothing but ruins. Families divided, some still loyal to Moscow, others praying for Kyiv's return. There's Tanya, a school teacher who teaches both the Russian and Ukrainian versions of history, depending on who knocks at her door. Or Marco, a former DPR mechanic who now works for Ukrainian operatives fixing drone parts in his garage. This isn't peace, it's survival theater. And here's the twist no one expected. Some Russian soldiers began switching sides, not for ideology, but out of fear, out of exhaustion, out of a simple realization: Ukraine wasn't giving up. They were evolving. Russian intelligence called these defectors ghosts, traitors with no identity. Dangerous because they knew both playbooks. Ukraine called them something else: proof. Proof that Donetsk wasn't lost, that even in hell, loyalty could be hacked,
repurposed, redeemed. And that brings us to today. Donetsk still stands, but only barely. It's a city held together by dread, duct tape, and desperation. The DPR government clings to control, broadcasting optimism over shattered radio towers. Russian troops still patrol, but fewer, and with more paranoia than pride.
Meanwhile, Ukrainian drones pass overhead like ghosts, quiet, constant, watching. Because this was never just about land. It was about endurance, about whose system collapses first. And in that contest, Ukraine may already have won, not with missiles, but with patience, with strategy, with the willingness to turn a city into a mirror and make its occupiers watch themselves decay. Because Donetsk wasn't taken, it was offered to the enemy like poisoned fruit, and now it's rotting in their hands. So where does this leave us?
Is Donetsk the blueprint for future warfare, where psyops, insurgents, and deepfakes replace blitz? Or is it a warning that no cause, no matter how noble, can survive the death of truth? There's no easy answer, only this. The next great war won't be fought for land. It will be fought for narrative.
And in Donetsk, Ukraine turned a tragic occupation into a masterpiece of manipulation, one that may echo across battlefields for decades to come. Because sometimes, the deadliest battlefield is one you let your enemy keep. If that blew your mind, share this with someone who still thinks this war is just about borders. And if you want more twisted stories like this one, subscribe now. We go where history hides.